Basically, if it wasn't for the Jehovah's Witnesses, you might not have the free speech rights you have today. I see them all the time in Baltimore. They have these stands that they set up, and they try to give people literature. And I've often thought about going up to one of them and saying, "Hey, I talked about you in class, but absolutely no, I don't want you to give me anything." So we can appreciate people's contributions without agreeing with everything about them. So let's talk about that a little bit. In the 1910s, during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson and Congress responded by criminalizing speech opposed to the U.S. war effort and or supportive of our enemies. And in 3 important Supreme Court cases, the justices upheld the constitutionality of these laws. Free speech norms were not very robust. In fact, they barely existed. For whatever reason, the founders wrote that, and for about 100 years after, the courts and the Congress didn't really pay much attention to that right. It just kind of sat there. And here's just some imagery from that. Don't talk. The web is spun for you with invisible threads. Keep out of it. Help to destroy it. Stop equals think. Ask yourself if what you were about to say might help the enemy. Spies are listening. And again, I think a majority of Americans were okay with this, but a lot were not. Here is a protest outside of the White House. It says, "Mr. President, remember the Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press." So people were arrested for speaking, for having opinions, for saying things like, "I'm a proud German," right, because we were fighting Germany during World War I, or "I think the Germans have a reason to fight," right? Anything like that, you could be arrested. Political prisoners who believe in this guarantee are now serving 20 years in prison. Most of us, whether you're left, right, or center, this shocks us today. Some people are saying this might return very soon. We'll see. But regardless, this is not the free speech norms we expect. So how did that change? Well, one of the justices, interestingly enough, dissented. And this doesn't happen very often, but his dissent actually became more influential than the actual decision by the court. So it's a really, really interesting moment in history. So Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously dissented. So he thought, I think, off the top of my head, I hope I'm saying this right, he agreed in the first 2 cases, but in the third one, and again, the nature of each case is not super important for our purposes today. He dissented in the last one. He changed his mind. He thought, I don't think the direction we're going is good, so he reversed course. He introduced this phrase into kind of American discourse that we still have, the marketplace of ideas, right? So he basically said, the First Amendment should protect it, should protect ideas, including offensive and dangerous speech from government censorship. This, I think, is an idea that your generation really needs to reconsider. When you try to get rid of offensive speech, you unwittingly empower other people to take away your speech when you are not kind of the dominant force in the culture. And some would say we're seeing that now. So here's Oliver Wendell Holmes. Amazing mustache. 10 out of 10. Here's a quote from him. "I think that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe." Loathe means deeply despise, right? It's kind of an old word. "And believe to be fraught with death." In other words, dangerous. "Unless they imminently threaten immediate interference with the lawful and pressing purposes of the law, that an immediate check is required to save the country." In other words, he's trying to strike a balance, right? He's saying, yes, some speech that is offensive, we need to protect it even if we hate it. But, yes, true, some speech is too far, right? Threats against people's lives, that kind of thing. Insurrectionist speech, that kind of thing, right? People had been kicking this idea around in law schools, but this is the first time someone as influential as a Supreme Court justice had said it. Here's the thing, though. It took about 2 decades for America for the courts to listen. And, as you know now from your assignment, in 1942, 2 Jehovah's Witnesses, let me pause right there. Mainstream Christians would say that Jehovah's Witnesses are not real Christians, but they consider themselves Christians. They do have beliefs that diverge from historic Christian doctrine. But they are a Christian sect, and one of their beliefs was that they could not swear allegiance to the United States, because they couldn't swear allegiance to any country because their allegiance was to God. So a few Jehovah's Witness kids in West Virginia, their parents said, "Don't stand for the pledge." Those kids were expelled. The parents sued, claiming this violated their free speech and religious expression rights. Also, I should say, saying the pledge was mandatory in most school districts, probably all school districts, right? If you went to a high school that said pledge every day, and some do, some don't, you could decide whether you stood or not. That was not the case back then. You had to stand. Or you get expelled, as these kids did. Also back then, if you got expelled, there wasn't like another thing for you. Right? Today, if you have like a troubled friend growing up or something, or if you had a hard time growing up, you get expelled, there's like alternative schools, right? That didn't exist back then. So basically their education was taken away from them. So, now I'm skipping over some details. There was a court case. The court case wound its way up through the system. Eventually it gets to the Supreme Court, and they agreed. It took 25 years. They agreed with Holmes. And they completely reversed course. They changed precedent. They said, we're going in the wrong direction. And again, the Great Dissent is just like a term for his dissent. And in this court case, the justices ruled that compulsory shows of patriotism were violations of free speech. So that is why when you were a high school student, if you didn't stand for the pledge, your teacher couldn't do anything. Or your teacher did do something and they were breaking the law. This landmark case established the baseline for modern free speech viewpoints. If when you started this class you were like, history's boring, like hopefully you're seeing now why I think that's insane. But look what happens when a very small, powerless people speak up, and stand for their rights. Sometimes it doesn't go this way. This is kind of a best case scenario, but if these people had never had the bravery to stand up for what they believed was true, we wouldn't be here right now in terms of free speech. We would be here, we would exist, obviously. I don't mean that. But in terms of our free speech norms that you enjoy, we might not be there. So this really, really, really did turn the tide of history.